distinguished visiting lecturer for this fiscal year and academic year, Martin Paulus. Martin received his medical degree in Germany, and then he followed that with a postdoctoral fellowship that was funded by the German Research Foundation in 1986 to, interestingly, to study calcium antagonists on animal models of mania at the University of San Diego. And after completing this postdoctoral fellowship, he went on to complete his clinical training in psychiatry, finishing with a residency at UCSD. He then joined the faculty in 1997 and rose to the rank of full professor in 2005, and has conducted a program that is very translational and involving computational psychiatry. I think before computational psychiatry was the buzzword. In 2014, he left UCSD to become the scientific director and president of the Laureate Institute for Brain Research in Tulsa, Oklahoma. For those of you who aren't familiar with this institute, it's endowed research institute whose mission is to discover the causes and cures for disorders of mood, anxiety, eating, and memory. Martin is very active in the psychiatric research community. He serves as a deputy editor of JAMA Psychiatry and serves as a member of the board of scientific counselors of the National Institutes of Mental Health. He's prolific. He has an H-index currently of 80 with 330 publications. And we're very excited to have him here in this virtual visit to present his work in computational approaches to anxiety and substance use. Martin, welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for the kind introduction. This is my first virtual grand rounds that I've given, so the rules of the games have changed. I have my Q&A and the chat box open because I know that it tends to be kind of the best way of kind of throwing questions at me. It's hard for the audience to kind of butt in when it comes to these virtual meetings. We've actually been Quentin Hoyes and Michael Browning and I have been organizing a transcontinental computational psychiatry work group for the last several years, and that was all online. So we did the whole thing online before online was a thing, and it's kind of interesting to see how that has now developed. It's the necessity with which we have to live for the foreseeable future. I want to thank everybody for being online today and spending a little bit of time with me. And I hope everybody is doing well. We're facing both a unprecedented health crisis as well as a social crisis. And I know that these things can have profound impacts on people, obviously, to the point that people's lives are severely affected by it. So I hope everybody's doing okay. Before I get started, I'm going to do something where I will be basically start by talking about why I think computational approaches can be useful. And we'll try to keep a fairly applied focus throughout. I will then introduce a couple of pieces of work that different people that I've been working with have been doing over the last few years. Probably try to stay relatively high level and not go so much into the nitty-gritty. Although people have questions, I'm hoping I can answer them. And then at the end, point to a couple of future directions that I think are really tough problems and tough nuts to crack. But before, let me see what I can do this year. Yeah, so these are the disclosures. I do write for UpToDate on methamphetamine dependence, which shouldn't really be a big issue for this presentation. And then I have funding support from NIMH, NIDA, and the NIGMS. So those are my main disclosures. I'm currently not on any boards for any pharmaceuticals. Okay, so I've already told you a little bit about the outline, but let me just kind of reframe that a little bit. So one of the things that I want to emphasize a little bit is sort of the bivariate notion of an explanatory and pragmatic framework. And it's been raised by a number of people, not just me, over the last few years. And I want to come back to it and remind people what the differences are. I will then, again, as I said, talk a little bit about computational psychiatry and how I view computational psychiatry. And then I will give examples of computational process dysfunctions in anxiety and substance use, and kind of talk a little bit about some of the work that, again, folks that have worked with me have done over the last few years and highlight really their work. That has to do with differentiating signal from noise during a sort of a change point detection task, adjusting to current and future error in a movement task, perception versus decision-making in an uncertain environment, and differentiating decision uncertainty from emotional conflict in an approach avoidance task. And then finally, strategic and tactical processing dysfunctions in substance use disorders. And then I will talk a little bit about future direction. I hope I'll get to that, because I do think it's an important aspect that I think we need to all recognize how tall the challenge really is. Okay, so let me just talk a little bit about, this was something that I wrote for JAMA Psychiatry a couple of years ago, where I tried to emphasize something that I felt has been missing in our in research in psychiatry, quite frankly. And that is that ultimately, as researchers, or what I called here problem solvers, we are beholden to the stakeholder demands, meaning that we're trying to solve problems for the people that are the stakeholders of the diseases that we're focusing on, which the stakeholders could be summarized into patients, providers, payers, or policymakers. And again, our job is primarily to identify what are researchable questions. And then the key thing, so for example, researchable questions, what are the decision-making dysfunctions in individuals with psychiatric disorders? And I know from just having attended the Neuroprism group that that's a central question that many of you are asking. But then, based on that is, we either have sort of a explanatory focus, in which case, we might say, how does the brain contribute to these dysfunctions? And in fact, actually, that's what Sophia emphasized in her postulates, that essentially we're trying to explain the phenomenology of psychiatric disorders in terms of the neurocircuitry that underlies the production of these symptoms and this phenomenology. And then really it gets to a level of causality. And I've been very, very interested in how do we explore different levels of causality. We all probably know that the gold standard to identify truly causal factors is the randomized controlled trial in human studies. In animal studies, we have many more options, but in human studies, it's really the RCT. But the problem is that in many cases, we really don't have the ability to do an RCT. RCTs have very many shortcomings, among which is the fact that they're actually not really set up well to study heterogeneity. And then, there's been a flurry of activity in the field of statistical causal inference over the last 10, 15 years that has now provided new tools and techniques that are available to do quasi-causal inference. And that's something that we've been working on, but which I will not talk about today. On the other side, we have the pragmatic approach. And in a sense, the pragmatic approach, one way to think about it is that we are trying to address a question that is that has real utility. So, for example, can we predict who, after discharge from a psychiatric hospitalization, will return within 2 weeks? say? That's a very pragmatic, practical question. And we're trying to predict, we're trying to generate prediction models. And obviously in that case, the predictions have to be accurate and robust. And so in that particular, we're trying to address that question. One of the key issues that we're trying to figure out is, can we use biological or other variables to predict clinically meaningful outcomes? People have been getting very excited about wearables and mobile mental health assessments, but fundamentally the question then boils down to, can we make accurate and robust predictions? So computational psychiatry speaks to both aspects here. And in particular, since the way that we, and when I say we, is really Quentin, Mike, and I have been formulating computational psychiatry, we've been very inclusive in bringing both machine learning and the model builders hopefully together. But I would be focusing primarily on the model side of things today. So the idea is that if you want to contrast what's the old, what's the new approach, which in some sense is a little bit misleading, but I want to kind of contrast that to kind of give you an idea of how I think about it. So in sort of the old approach, you might say, okay, you observe a behavior, and maybe you have a behavioral task, and then you use basically a correlational approach to identify how are some of these behavioral indices related to what's going on in the brain during that period of time. And that might be, so for example, I show here a graph that's related to stop signal task. I'll come back to that task in a little bit. And it might be sort of a stop success, or it might be just simply how many errors somebody makes during a particular stop trial or stop block. And then you relate that to brain activity. And there's obviously many people have pursued this approach. Sort of the new approach, and it's really not so new anymore because of course people have been now doing it for years, is you start out again with the behavior, but now you're basically putting a processing model together. The processing model is nothing else but you formalize your intuition about what you think is going on while the person is engaging in that behavior. It could be, we've used this Bayesian sensor integration model that Angela Yu and others have made popular for the subsignal task, but there could be other models as well. And then what you're doing is you're testing the model. You're testing how good the model actually agrees with what the data you observe. You do potentially model selection, and you find the best model for the observations. And then you relate the model parameters, which now quantify specific processes that are important for, say, stop signal behavior or other behaviors. And you relate those parameters back to what's going on in the brain. And it's essentially that kind of translational work from behavior to brain activation that I would say has changed the field a little bit. Now, what's important here, and this is something that I think we've sort of recently summarized in a review paper that's coming out, is that you have to think of computational psychiatry not just between circuits and behavior, but really between a whole host of levels of analysis. And of course, we're very familiar with that because RDoC has made these multi-level assessments very popular and really put, in a sense, the focus on the fact that we have to understand psychiatric diseases in terms of a multi-level dysfunction. So here I've sort of just highlighted a few of them, from symptoms to genes. But what's critically important is that the whole organism, the agent, organizes itself into a dynamical state. And the dynamical state may consist of a combination of behavioral characteristics, circuit characteristics, cell characteristics, or molecular characteristics. And it may be really quite complex. in a sense that there's no easy mapping across these levels of analysis, and finding the appropriate mapping itself is a big challenge. But the idea then is that this state changes over time, obviously, because there's internal changes that happen and external changes, but that we can describe this change by a function of sorts, and then it becomes again the task of computational psychiatry to find the best functions describing these changes in the dynamical state, and to identify the parameters that are most relevant. So in a sense, and so what I'm going to show you down the line here is a different mathematical formulations of a process that changes over time, for which we have identified parameters that could be disease relevant. The field, quite frankly, is at a very early stage. So we shouldn't necessarily constrain ourselves at this point if we know what the true functions are or what the true parameters are. It's not even clear that that the way we're nicely sorting our diagnoses, which obviously have very limited biological, which map very limited to the biology, are really the best way of actually identifying processes that are dysfunctional in different populations. So, I'm saying this because I want to preface anything that I show with the fact that there needs to be an exploration of different behavioral processes and how they're being mapped onto psychiatric diseases. And in a sense, here's another way of showing this, that what we're basically saying is, from a computational perspective, is that we have a hidden process, and that hidden process changes over time, and that hidden process generates an observation that we then basically can measure, and then we make the idea is that we need to make inferences about the underlying hidden process from the observations. And then the challenges are, among the challenges is that, for example, the environments in which this process occur could be highly variable. This is a contribution that Michael Browning has done some really nice work on, that, for example, people with anxiety have a very difficult time differentiating volatile environments, which, for example, the characteristics of the reward or aversiveness of the environment changes rapidly versus a stable environment where those changes don't take place. But the idea here is, the goal for us is to identify the underlying hidden state and the functions that move that state forward over time. Here's sort of a foreshadowing of what I will talk about in the future directions. One of the key challenges, and this has been now widely accepted, is that we have a number of very good instruments on a sort of self-report or survey level that capture various types of dimensions of psychopathology, say. But the unfortunate element of that is that these instruments don't really relate well to some of the behavioral tasks that we're using. So this is work that actually had been done in Russ Poldrack's group, came out a couple of years ago now, and showed that really there isn't a very good match between the behavioral and the self-report level in terms of executive processing in this particular case. And what's more, and I think we've had that discussion already this morning, is that our behavioral probes are not all that great when it comes to, say, retest reliability. And this is sort of shown down here, that even some of the tools that we're using on a basically on a daily basis, that we do make a lot of inferences about, have a very limited stability within an individual, which gives rise to a low interclass correlations, and which make them which makes these probes have limited utility when it comes to using them for, say, treatment studies or within subjects designs. So this is something that we have to clearly work on, and we have our work cut out for ourselves. So let me just do some 5 minutes of shameless self-promotion, and then I'll talk about other people's work. So one of the things that I've been interested in, again, coming now from a heuristic perspective, is that a lot of decision-making had been focused on reward-related decision-making in the sense that we formulate a lot of a computational model with respect to how much, if I do something, I get a benefit from that, and then I do it more, or I kind of change my patterns of my behavior. What interestingly has much less well studied, but I think has a really profound impact, and particularly in psychiatry, is what been referred to as aversion-related decision-making in the context of negative reinforcement. So from a computational perspective, obviously the reinforcement learning framework has been very important in helping us to understand how we make choices and how our choices change as a function of the feedback that we're getting. People have been formulating dysfunctions in terms of sensitivity to reward and punishment, in terms of the speed with which an individual updates their internal model. Also, something that has been quite important is sort of the inherent association of a particular option with an approach or avoidance behavior, which can be quantified using sort of Pavlovian biases, as well as altered reference points. The idea is that there is not an absolute value of reward or an absolute value of punishment, but that the reward and punishment is being evaluated with an internal sort of stable homeostatic frame. Now, the other element is that, there's been also this active inference framework. And so active inference work is really a way of formulating behavior as subserving the establishment of a predictive environment. I'll come back to that when I get to the details of it. But the idea is that as we're behaving in such a way to make what we think will happen will actually happen. And in that case, it's a lot of it has to do with new behaviors, which may be exploratory behaviors versus exploitative behaviors. That there's behaviors that have associated response cost. And what's important is that we have particular beliefs about what's called state observation relationship. The idea is that we behave in a way that we think our system is requiring us to do. What that means is that we don't actually fully know what we need and what we don't need. We think we know what we need and don't need, but we have an inherent mapping of our internal state onto our belief systems. And so a part of the notion and dysfunction in active inference is that these mappings between state and observation might actually be altered. And so that's basically one way to think about this of course, in the reinforcement framework, is that you have states, you have actions, and these actions have a value associated with it. So for example, you might be in addiction, you might be in an intoxicated state, which then the drug taking maintains that intoxicated state, whereas not taking a drug gets you into an abstinent state. And so then the different reinforcement processes can be understood as either, I'm in an abstinent state, so I want to be in an intoxicated state. So the positive reinforcement will be driving the behavior to make me more likely to be in the intoxicated state. On the other hand, and this is important, so let me just go through that. I could be the abstinent state itself, particularly in the protracted situation of somebody being in a with a substance use disorder, can be highly aversive. And then the action, instead of driven by a positive frame, may actually be driven by a negative reinforcement frame, which is you're trying to avoid the absent state because it's an aversive state. It has it's associated with withdrawal symptoms, and therefore you're driven by so the not taking drug would keep you in the absent state, and the taking drug would get you in the intoxicated state, which has a lack of absence of the aversive state, which is the abstinent state. We've also formulated the same thing in terms of, say, in this case, social anxiety, where you have state action values. In the framework of value-based decision-making, essentially, you basically select actions that increase the future value of states. And you're trying to maximize the value inherently. And if it's based on positive reinforcement, as I said, you select an action that makes the state, the positive value state more likely. If you use a negative reinforcement framework, you select an action that makes the negative value state least likely. So, that, for example, explains a lot of avoidance behavior and anxiety, where the avoidance makes the exposure, which is being seen as aversive, less likely to occur. Now, in the active inference, you can formulate the same thing in the active inference framework. And again, the key element here is that you have these state and observation mappings, and that's the inherent sort of in a way in the jargon language is called a hidden Markov or hidden decision-making model, because you don't really know what the true state is. You infer the state, and the way you infer it is you have these mappings from how you feel, that's observational, like calm or irritable, from whether you're absent or intoxicated. And then you have various policies, these policies are evaluated, just like in the value framework. You're evaluating your actions based on maximizing the reward or maximizing the future value of your actions. In the active inference framework, you're actually maximizing it, or you're using what's called the free energy principle, which I'll get back to in an example, is really one way to think about it is you're trying to minimize the state that is expected after a certain action with the state that is observed after a certain action. So you're trying to act in such a way that you have less and less surprise. Now, the important element is that, of course, in some sense, surprise is meaningful because it helps you to learn and adapt. So you have to have a compromise between the preference of something and the surprise or the information gain of the action, and that's essentially that compromise is what is quantified by the free energy. Again, I think that you can, even though it's in this case you're framing it in terms of a belief structure, in terms of prediction, you can again put it into a positive and negative reinforcement framework, where you can select action based on policies that make an observation more likely, or you select the actions that make a particular observation least likely. And the reason for that is because it matters if in terms of what drives the process, because it helps you to identify which process to target when you actually have to develop an intervention. That's really why this distinction, which otherwise seemed a little academic, is actually important. And so, within this context of different processing dysfunctions, we had developed, particularly as it relates to interoception, various possible failure modes that would explain why people behave a certain way. And I just want to kind of walk you through this again on a more conceptual level, because I think it's useful to think, how do we get to these models eventually? So we basically had proposed that maybe two ways of how to think about how anxiety may be occurring within, say, an active inference framework is one where you have what's called hyper-precise priors. That basically all that means is you have very strong beliefs of how something should be. And the other thing is context rigidity. And what that means is that you have certain beliefs. Normally, these beliefs are calibrated by which environment you find yourself in. But in some cases, in some people, the difference in environment doesn't really calibrate the belief. And so we put this in sort of a cartoonish framework. The idea, of course, is that you always have some uncertainty to any kind of sensory afferences that you get. In this particular case, you might be listening to a sound and you're perceiving this sound, and the sound might be coming from a rabbit or it might be coming from a bear. And you have certain prior beliefs about whether this is going to be a rabbit or a bear. And of course, the notion and the connection to interoception here is that whether it's coming from a rabbit or a bear will have very different responses on how your internal body responds to the sound. So in a healthy brain, of course, you are using those afferences, both the interoceptive afferents and the sensory afferents, to form a prediction. And then the prediction, once you actually see what generates that sound, help you to adjust to your future priors. So for example, if you were in a certain space, you heard a sound, the sound was, you thought maybe it could be a bear, could be a rabbit, and then you see a rabbit and you think, okay, for the future, when I in that context, it's most likely going to be a rabbit. Now, the issue with dysfunctional brain, again, particular emphasis on anxiety here, is that already anxious people have very strong prior preferences, so that they hear the uncertain evidence, but in that context, it's already very strongly biased towards a bear than a rabbit. But what's more is that after basically seeing the evidence, in this case, it's the same evidence that the healthy person has seen, they are unable to update the prior beliefs in such a way that that the evidence overwhelms the prior in a sense and generates now, okay, you don't have to worry about bears. It's a rabbit, and that maintains, of course, anxiety, because the next time the person is exposed to that environment, the overwhelming prior is still existing. And therefore, the whole response will be, oh, this is going to be a bear. So that's one element. The other element was that of context rigidity, as I said before. It's the same process from an updating perspective, but in this case, now you are in a different environment. Say you are from a foresty environment to a prairie environment, and the idea is that that in a healthy brain, the healthy brain has different priors for different environments, and therefore can have more adaptive observations and can incorporate that evidence in a more adaptive way. But in an anxious brain, the environment does not calibrate the priors, and therefore essentially the same process happens again, that the overwhelming evidence of, say, a rabbit is not appropriately incorporated to update the priors for future decision making or for future predictions. So that's basically the context rigidity argument. So again, these are conceptual level models on anxiety in this particular case. But now I want to get to some more really put some meat to the bone, in a sense, and give you some examples of providing computational models to various behaviors. And before I get to that, I want to just talk about a little bit about the study that we did in Tulsa over the last 5 years, which I'm quite excited about. So when I started in Tulsa at LIBOR, as the scientific director, we initiated this T1000 study. So the T1000 study at that time was a very similar study to what I had been doing with an RDoc R01 at UCSD, which is essentially using a transdiagnostic approach, bringing in people through various negative valence questionnaires, and then doing a multi-level assessments. Now, the only difference was that because of the fortunate and generative nature of the foundation, we were able to do this at a level that no NIMH grant would have been able to do. So we have, again, we recruited 1,000 people. We've actually all done with that. We split the 1,000 people into 500 and 500, and with the idea that we use the first 500 to do exploratory research and establish hypotheses and mechanisms, and then do confirmatory studies with the second 500. So we have not touched the second 500. We have all the data. It's all curated, but we basically are still in the first 500 running through various models, and that's what you will be seeing today. But then, with the results, we will then register our hypotheses, and we'll do, by trying to do privacy preserving confirmation on the second 500. That's the idea. It's a longitudinal study. We followed these people for 1 year. And we did, again, we did a very extensive imaging, symptom behavioral assessment. We did imaging, we did simultaneous EEG, fMRI. We have a broad spectrum of analytes that we've tested that are inflammatory, metabolic. We collaborated with the UCSD microbiome group. So we have microbiome profile on these folks. And now we have GWASed all of these people, so we have over 500 polygenic risk scores on all of these people, and we've integrated all of this in a nice REDCap database. So, and all of the data are in a bits format, so they're basically properly structured. We're hoping. I'm talking about this because I'm trying to get people excited about it. We're hoping to make this data public relatively soon, because there's clearly so much more information in there that what we can process as a relatively small institute. But the idea is to then have other people make discoveries using this data set. And just to kind of give you an idea, the specific aims here was literally what we also had been proposed before in an RDoc-related grant. First, to identify latent variables. I won't be talking about that today, but I can take questions in the future. And then to also use these latent variables to form clinically meaningful outcome predictions, and that's why we followed these people for a year. Using standard questionnaires and the PROMIS system, that is a patient-related outcome management system. So, so the first study that came out of that was computational nature. Was something that I did with Crane Wang, who's now at Apple, and we were looking at processing dysfunction, anxious people, using the change point detection task. So again, I don't want to go too much into the nitty gritty, but this particular version of the change point detection task was something that actually we worked on with Angela Yu. The notion is that you have 3 spots that you have to make decisions over, and that you are being variably reinforced on any of those spots, and you have to basically find which is the best spot, and then that spot changes. And so the idea is, how do you learn about that change? And then what we basically found, which was really interesting, is that when we compared a bunch of models, and what we found is that this dynamic adjustment model was actually best performing. And what it showed us is that the base learning rate in the anxious people in this particular task was actually high, but the learning adjustment rate was low. And what does that mean? What that means is that if the learning rate is too high, then random fluctuations are actually seen as potential informative signals. But if you're not adjusting to when things are really changing, you're not picking up as quickly that something really major has changed. And that makes your adaptation to changes in the environment slow. You know, that's where the context rigidity aspect comes in. And in that particular case, what we basically found is that the anxious individuals overinterpret statistical fluctuations as a sign of meaningful change. This may be in some ways related to the work that Michael Browning has been doing in different volatile environments, because if you can't differentiate when things are stable and when things are changing, because you're overinterpreting the random fluctuations as potential change, then you really have difficulty adjusting to volatile versus stable environments. So why would this be important? Again, from a very pragmatic perspective. You know, we know that many of the new modern treatments of anxiety are based on relearning fear-related content. And you know, if the anxious people cannot really adjust as much, we have to see this almost as a processing dysfunction that we can't assume, you know, that certain, say, behavioral techniques work the same way in anxious people as they work in healthy people. Also, it provides us with a potential target, because if these adjustments are too small, is there pharmacology that we can do to tweak that adjustment? We have a little bit of a hint, but unfortunately, again, I can't really go into the details today. But the nice thing is that, again, this is also something that sort of a recurring theme here, is that the computational approach really allows us to precisely locate where the behavioral dysfunction is. And does that in a very, what I would say, transparent manner, because you set up different models. You let these models get arbitrated with respect to how well they describe the data. And then you look at the parameters of these models and you see exactly which parameters are different in the different groups. And so we kind of continued working with various paradigms that we've obtained during the T1000 study. And Jonathan Howlett, who's now an assistant professor at UCSD, and he's been working with me for a number of years, had been looking at a particular task, which I think is actually a really, really exciting task. And I try to get people kind of excited about, because it has some properties, which I'll talk about in a moment, that I think are very, very, very attractive. So it's a very simple task. The task is essentially this. You have a joystick, but you don't have to do it with a joystick. You can do it with other things too. And you have a little car, and you're basically being told that you need to get that car to that stop sign as quickly as possible. But you can't run over that stop sign, because then you get points withdrawn. So it's sort of like it's an approach and avoidance task in a sense. And so what we are measuring is this joystick velocity and acceleration. And so basically we're getting a whole trajectory, and in fact you can see the trajectories down there of velocity over time, of what the person is doing in getting the car to that stop sign. Because it's such a simple task, it's quickly learned. There's nothing really too much to it. But then what we do is we actually use what's called a PID controller as a model to model the trajectories. And the PID controller has been around for many years. It's actually in every thermostat these days. It decomposes the error over time into a proportional error, that's just basically how far you're off, into an integrated error, which means how far have you been off over time, and a differential error, which is like how much are you particularly off at this moment in time. In our case, we only use the proportional differential, the proportional differential part, not the integrated part, but because that model was sufficient. But first of all, the model really describes the data well. So you can see here where we have the data and then actually simulated data from the model. And you can see that there's virtually a complete overlap of the data, which is nice. The second thing is, so the second thing that's important about this, again, you get the whole trajectory. So you get a huge number of data points. And so what's important here is that you can, with a few trials, you can get very accurate assessment of the model, and which makes it pragmatically very attractive. The other thing that I'm showing here is that it's highly reliable, that these model parameters are very stable, and they correlate very highly with odd and even trials. And so that's really important too. The ICCs of the model parameters are incredibly high, which is very nice. And then what we did on top of that, we created a hierarchical Bayesian a model and model comparison. So that's basically using we built the inferences hierarchically. So we basically, on the lowest level, we basically just have the acceleration that we're modeling that is made up from an error term and a derivative term, and then the model generates that acceleration through the proportional constant and the differential constant. And for each of these, so this is for one trial, or for one time point, I should say. This is for one trial, and then this is nested within the subject. And then even we have then a group parameters. So this allows us to really test in a very nice way the hypotheses on each level, and we're using Stan for doing essentially getting the posterior distributions of these model parameters. And so what you see here is essentially the posterior distribution, the median, and the credible interval, various credible intervals of the posterior. But the point here is that really what we found is that the subjects that had the highest level of fear showed decreased weighting on the current and also decreased weighting of the rate of change. So it was both the differential and the proportional error that was smaller in people with higher fear. And you can see that by seeing that the coefficient for both KD and on the next graph I show KP is significantly different from 0. There was an effect of age, there was an effect of gender. So in the way that you would predict, older people are slower and they're just slower. But this was all figured in. The other thing we also then did, we looked at their some of the structural characteristics of these people. We found that the model parameters KD, this differential controller parameter, was actually related to both ACC and caudal to ACC volume, and this was true even after adjusting for all the other parameters. So the other nice thing is that this finding was specific to fear, even after we controlled for negative affect. So there was no effect on negative affect, and so it was a specific fear-related finding. So the idea here is that within this PID model framework, we can parse errors that that anxious people produce in a very useful way into fear-specific errors that affect both the current and the differential errors over time. And so, again, I want to highlight the simplicity of this approach and the robustness of this approach is really striking. And again, particularly after we had discussions earlier this morning, we're trying to find paradigms that are a little bit more robust. Here's I want to talk a little bit about something that Jonathan had worked on after the previous study, that is looking at combining various models together to get a better measure of in terms of the decision process. So in this particular case, he applied a hybrid Rescorla-Wagner model with the drift diffusion model. So again, using the change point detection task that I showed. But the idea here is that that basically what's happening is that you're modeling the reaction time and the changes in preferences at the same time. So that both of those models affect one another, updated with respect to one another, so that the reward expectation influences the drift diffusion bias and drift parameters, or both. So the idea is that, okay, if I know it's going to be at this location, I'm going to respond faster. I don't need as much evidence to make my decision, and so that's the gist of it. And then you test again. What's important here, you test a whole bunch of models to see which model actually best describe the data. And so and again, what he did is he embedded this model into a hierarchical statistical model from a trial, a subject, and a group perspective. What he found again was that it was the individuals who had the highest fear reported the lowest rate of perceptual updating using the drift diffusion model. So again, maybe giving us an idea that the updating of the belief systems is altered in anxious people, and that it is slower in anxious people. So that's basically summarizing here, where we specifically related to perceptual circuits, because that's what is basically being modeled by the drift diffusion model. So next, I want to just talk a little bit about, and I'm already realizing, just to kind of give you a meta comment, looking at the time, that I won't get through all the examples, but I want to give you one example of an active inference framework, and then probably what may be best is for me to just summarize and tell you where things I think are going. So this is work that has been done by Ryan Smith, who's joined us a couple of years ago here at LIBOR. He had previously worked for a while with Carl Friston at UCL, and he has fully embraced the active inference framework, and we have been fully committed to make that active inference framework palatable to the rest of the world. So hopefully I can do a decent job in translating some of Carl's ideas into ideas that maybe the rest of us can understand. So this was a work that actually also goes together with Robin Opperly, who's a clinical psychologist in our institute. And she's been interested in approach avoidance conflict in anxiety for quite some time. So she had actually sort of proposed that really part of the problem in anxiety is that anxious people have a very difficult time navigating approach avoidance conflict. And so, and in particular, that they tend to not come to a proper decision because they have a difficulty weighing should they encounter the aversive consequences at the same time as they would need to get the positive reward. So let me just kind of show you what the task looks like. So this is this approach avoidant conflict task. There are several different trial types. Fundamentally, you have this little agent here that you're supposed to move around. If you basically, the further you move them to this side, you basically would encounter, oops, sorry. You would encounter something negative. The more you would over to this side, you would encounter something positive, which is indicated by this cloud and by this sun here. So essentially, you have your decision is how likely do you want to encounter something positive or something negative. And so in an avoid threat condition, it's very clear you have a negative thing here, you have a positive thing here, so you avoid the negative thing, so you go move over to the sun. in the approach reward condition, you have reward on both sides, and you just basically go to the side that gives you the higher reward. So that's not. And then you have the approach avoidance conflict, where you have essentially no threat, but you have here a reward, but you also have a threat associated with the reward. And the threat is just an IEPS, a ghastly IEPS picture. We've tried different things, and the IEPS pictures work pretty well because we can see skin conductance change and all that kind of stuff. But so then so then we basically turn up the volume by giving you more points if you basically go over and approach the conflict situation. So we have 2 points, 4 points, and 6 points, and later on they're redeemed in terms of money. And so, so the setup is that you have the decision phase. You see this affective stimulus, which is again an IEPS picture for about 6 seconds, and then you get the points, and then the trial occurs. So what? So again, the way that Ryan translated that is into an active inference model is that you have various matrices that do mappings, and they're conveniently called A, B, or C. So the A matrix is essentially this hidden state. So you have the observation to a hidden state mapping. You have the relationship, the B matrix is basically the dynamic matrix between the current state and the previous state. And you have the C matrix, which is essentially a preference matrix. So it's like you like this better than that better. And then what you do is you impose on these matrix relationships that generate the observations. In this case, generate which selection the person is making. You put on this 2 free parameters: the decision uncertainty and the emotional conflict. And here's just simple simulation of what you would expect if you have various parameters. But we actually estimate these parameters from the data. And so what he found is that, and this was actually 3 groups, and I won't talk about the substitutes group in this context, but that there's significantly greater decision uncertainty in both depression, in this mood group, depression anxiety group, as well as in the substance user group. And what's interesting is that these actually related quite well to the subjective report. So, decision uncertainty was related to, I often found it difficult to decide which outcome I wanted. I always tried to move all the way from the outcome. So it basically correlated with some of those avoidance behaviors. So it actually seems to make sense that it actually captures a particular aspect of the of that. So in combination, it was really nice that this model really highly accurately generate that behavior. And then the parameters shows really strong relationship to the self-reports. And that emotional conflict, which I didn't talk so much about here, was uniquely associated with self-reported anxiety on the task. And then the beta parameter, which is the decision uncertainty, was uniquely associated with self-reported difficulty and difficulty making decisions on the task. So, so the idea here is, again, we were able to take a task, a behavioral task, decompose it into various processes, and then relate these processes to constructs that are meaningful as it relates to anxiety. So what I'm going to do now, because I know what I'm mindful of the time, is I'm going to skip over a bunch of studies, which I would have loved to show you, but basically just give you a similar gist of the kind of work we're doing. But I want to talk about one more thing, and maybe then we can have a little bit of a discussion. So let me just kind of quickly move through some of these things here to see whether I can get to the very end. Yeah. Well, let me just say that I think that all of these studies, and again, right now, and you should be mindful of this, all I showed you was behavioral level studies. All of these studies show us that we can identify actually fairly robustly various actually David has coined the term computational failure modes in both anxiety and substance use. And some of them relate to reduced action precision, attenuated error control, attenuated updating of incoming information, exaggerated processing of uncertainty. And what's nice about it is they can be readily assessed with behavioral paradigms. What I didn't show you so much about is that they can be associated with distinct neural circuits. And what's important, and again, this gets back to the pragmatic utility, they can be used to develop specific failure mode interventions. And I think that's where sort of, trying to think about what do stakeholders want. They want us to come up with things that make people with mental health disorders better, faster, and it keeps them healthy and prevent them from relapse. So the idea, of course, is that by targeting these processes and helping people developing to improve these processes, we not only reduce their disorder, but we also make it less likely that they will have another episode. At least in this group of mood and anxiety. Of course, we have to look at it slightly differently with other disorders. Let me now point something that I think that we need to all be aware of. This is something that, in fact, Chunlang Feng, who was a postdoc with me, he's back in China now, Wes Thompson and I have been working on. We've done a meta-analysis on, so we were interested in, okay, so what is on average the relationship between brain circuit activation and behavior? And so what Chunlang did, he was very heroic. He went through all the studies that had published brain behavior relationships in terms of fMRI studies. There were about 1,000 of them that he specifically focused on, and as it relates to really affective relationship, I should say. So we didn't look at cognitive studies. And then he screened through them, he extracted them, and then he plotted the effect sizes that he calculated against the sample size. And that's what you see in various scatter plots on the first row. And the second row is actually a multimodal model of those effect sizes as a function of sample size. And what you see is that invariably, the effect sizes decreases as a function of sample size and tends to sort of stabilize in the sense of asymptotes at about an effect size of 0.2, maybe 0.1, 0.2. And so that means that the amount of variance that we can account for in these brain behavior relationships is extremely limited. And why is that important? So let me kind of now show you my last slide before I kind of give my thank you thing. So we know that people are now doing machine learning in a very reasonable way, right? We have, it's clearly people have understood that you have to have a training and a testing set, that basically you build you do feature selection, feature weighing, a combination. People use, if you want to separate it, now machine learning and deep networks. I think people are also more aware of the fact that whether they want to build predictive or explanatory models, all of that actually has penetrated the field reasonably well. What I think has not penetrated the field is this graph. And this is something that we have to take very seriously. So what I did here, this is something that statisticians have known for a long time. So we often talk about the amount of variance explained in a model, and we're familiar with that term. But the question really is how much more precise does that, if we have a model, does that make our prediction? So, for example, as we compare to just predicting the mean. So if we just take the mean, we have an error that's basically a standard deviation, right? Because that is exactly the prediction around the mean. And so you can relate then everything to, if I make a model, how much more accurate does my model get? And the unfortunate part is that the relationship between the relative size of the error of the prediction as it relates to the percent variant explained is a very nonlinear function. What that means is that for a huge part of the variance, you don't reduce the error very much at all. So let me just give you an example. So for a model that explains 60% of the variance in your data, you would reduce your prediction error by about a little over 30%. So instead of predicting the mean, which would give you just the mean prediction for everything, you predict now the model prediction, and on average you would be about 30% better. That's not a lot. And that is what I think is really the problem. It only really gets much better as you get into the 80–90%. Now, all of you know that none of our models that we create explain even 60% of the variance. I mean, we get very excited if we explain 40 to 50% of the variance, and then typically it's a fairly trivial relationship. So what that means is that it's going to be extremely difficult the way we currently are set up to make individual level predictions. I just don't see that happening and it doesn't make a difference what kind of model you're using. And there are studies out now that show that, whether you use a fancy statistical machine learning model or a linear regression, most of the time you don't get that much better with the machine learning over regression. But the point here is that it's going to be very, very difficult to make individual level predictions, which is somewhat disappointing because, I was very gung-ho on trying to find a way of finding biomarkers or building models that will really make a difference for an individual person. And I think that that's something that we have to have a vigorous discussion about, and that we have to think about what do we need to do to increase that variance that we need to account for to make better individual level predictions. So I want to leave you with that. I know it's a kind of a challenging aspect to end a presentation on, but I want to thank you. I know I ran over a little bit. I don't want to get too much into the Q&A here, but hopefully you have some questions, or hopefully you have some comments. I'd be happy to take some of those, and I want to thank you again for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. You can hear the resounding applause through our web.
Oh, it's overwhelming.
This is kind of the challenge, appreciating one of the challenges of this webinar format. But that's Martin. You've compressed this presentation to present a broad scale of information, and also leaving us with some aspects about concerns about the future, which is good, because it sounds like this thing about the individual level predictions, which I think will be I'm sure lots of people are going to want to speak, is very important. I want to start off by asking a question related to your start-stop task. Your start-stop task, which I found to be it's kind of counterintuitive, because this is kind of almost like a motor, somewhat you'd think is a motor processing task, but it's informing something about the anxiety piece. And I'm thinking about this, oh my gosh, what's the relevance of this to a complex thing such as anxiety disorder, right? And I imagine how this flying and study section that we sat in together on, it's like,
right.
But yet you have this extremely high ICC, and yet it's explaining things in terms of the symptomatology and things like that. That it's explaining something, I want to hear more. It gets my attention, but it's not kind of tied in with what we typically think is the actual underlying pathophysiology or aspects. Could you comment a little bit on, because I'm sure you've thought about this quandary?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that what you what you bring up is exactly what reviewers have brought up, which is, okay, so here's a very basic motor task. What does that have to do with anxiety? And of course, the way to think about this is just like we built this hierarchical model is, yes, of course, it's a motor task, but the motor behavior is influenced by the beliefs of what you need to be doing about this task, right? So you have a goal state, you have to go to that stop sign, and you have a belief of what it means to run over that stop sign. And that has a certain aversion associated with it internally. And in a sense, you are creating a belief system about what you need to be doing. So that is where the higher order processing comes in. Now, what's also important here, which is why I like this so much, you can build in the other elements. So for example, we have, part of this actual task, which I didn't talk so much about, we have a simple motor task where we just measure how quickly somebody can move a joystick, right? Because that's just a simple motor. And we can use the parameter that we get from that calibration as one of the parameters into the model. So and that's why I showed this hierarchical Bayesian model, given with the idea that you build into that model all the other potential motor levels that can account for the variance, because we don't want to, the point is you want to pick up the variance that's relevant to the constructs that we're interested in. I'm not a Parkinson's researcher, or I'm not a motor disorder researcher. I'm interested in mood and anxiety disorder and addiction. So I want to see is what element of anxiety influences that motor behavior. So the way to think about this is really, yes, it is a very simple task, but on top of that simple task are belief systems that are specific or are peculiar to those people with anxiety over. Easy to say. So if you're a laid back person, you don't care about where that car ends up, because that I'm just telling you to do that task. But if you're an anxious person, you want to do it right, and you want to get it just And so the idea is, so what dysfunctions are associated with that belief system? And that's what was so nice to see, is that we can actually attribute a portion of the variance to these altered error processes. And after accounting for a lot of other effects, like, for example, which I didn't talk about, males and females are different on this task, and we account for these effects, and these effects are big. We can, young and old are different, and we can account for those effects, and the effects are not small either. So the beauty of it is you can compare, again, that's the beauty of this hierarchical framework. You compare the effect sizes, and that's what I showed you, the graphs there. And you can say, okay, yeah, the anxiety effect, it's not huge, right? The gender effects and the age effects are bigger. But yet they are still highly significant.
Right.
Can you?
So you wanted to say something. I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, it's great. I have audio. Martin, I was realizing as you were giving your really quite wonderful presentation, how strange it must feel, because you don't have any audience where you're getting feedback, right? Facial expressions, etc. So that's part of what is both rewarding and at times aversive when we give talks, right? Depending on the facial
Absolutely.
we're seeing.
Yeah.
But I thought I'd keep audio, so at least you get to have a question, from a real person in real time with vocal prosody happening here. This is sort of a riff on both Kelvin's question and your answer, which I think are both super interesting. It's even if you don't want to use the term beliefs, one can think of these very simple tasks as picking up certain fundamental aspects about how a nervous system is representing the environment and is valuing or assigning value to contingencies in the environment. So the laid back person doesn't assign much value to whether or not they're going over the stop line, right? And the nervous system of the anxious individual, for some reason, places a high, valuation on, reducing what they think are, or not making errors, which seems so important to them. And it's an interesting way of flipping how we think about psychiatric manifestations of psychiatric illness, because perhaps some of these higher order symptom clusters that we see are really almost epiphenomena that get layered on more fundamental aspects of how our nervous system is programmed genetically by environmental influences, et cetera, to represent information changing. Information in the environment changes, and that information and contingencies associated with those changes. And then all the metacognitive stuff kind of gets layered on top of that, so to speak. And I was wondering if that fits in at all with your rubric, if you could comment on that.
Yeah, no, actually, and as you were saying that, I think, so here's what's interesting. Of course, we have developed, a number of people have developed really beautiful cognitive tasks to tease apart different aspects of higher order cognition and, now metacognition. And I think these are, they are important because they tell us something multifaceted about how, disease, like say anxiety or depression or even schizophrenia, how they affect these very sophisticated cognitive processes. And I think they're still important. Part of it is also that these more sophisticated tasks sometimes are hard to replicate because every time you may slightly approach the problem slightly differently, which makes then for greater error, interpersonal error variance, which makes the ICCs lower. But I still think that these complex tasks are important. Whereas if you think about it on a daily basis, what are you doing on a daily basis? Many of the things you do are simple motor decision. It's like, how do you walk from point A to point B? How do you, when you go shopping, where do you go from one aisle to the next aisle? I mean, a lot of things are very simple behaviors, and yet your brain state, your higher order brain state, still has significant influence on how you make those decisions and how you execute those motor functions. So so the way I see it is that we need those complex cognitive functions to better tease apart into, like, it's sort of like saying, if I want to know, say, this task will not tell me whether in my thinking about, say, if I'm socially anxious, whether my thinking is because, I feel like people are not valuing what I have to say, or they don't like my appearance, or any of those detailed aspects. That will not be solved by a simple motor task. The way I see this more is that if you want a task that maybe is a temperature gauge of where the person is at, you want a task that's simple, easy to do, and can be done many, many times over. I mean, it's the same thing, for example, let me kind of jump to a different system now. You could make the argument that, we have very sophisticated way of measuring inflammation now. We have cytokines, we have the inflammasome, and then we have CRP. It turns out for so many applications, CRP seems incredibly useful. Even now with COVID, it turns out that CRP is one of the best predictors of whether somebody will develop a cytokine storm or not. So the point is that, and the CRP is completely, it's a very simple biological response. It's mostly peripheral, and it's, it's a proxy. And it will not give you the details of the intricacies of the inflammatory machinery and the orchestration of the inflammatory response. So what I'm hoping for is that we can come up with something that is like the CRP for the psychiatrist, that can give us a little bit of an edge on saying, yes, this person anxiety-related processing is still at this level, and we need to get them down to this level objectively. That's what I'm hoping for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
Right.
I can't help, I have to make one other or ask you to make one other comment. And this just relates partly because of how you had opened your comments to us at the earlier meeting. As I was hearing about some of the active inference framework and this notion that, one of the things, again, that the processes of the nervous system is engaging and the brain is engaging in is this mapping between current state and observations. And I found myself wondering if our current kind of pandemic and kind of global crisis we're in, where it's no, for most of us, it's perhaps for all of us, we're no longer able to have this sense of a stable mapping between kind of current state and predicted state and observations and anticipated observations. If that's one explanatory mechanism for how anxiety gets generated. I just thought it would be fun if you would riff on that for a moment. For this
so I think it's a very, by the way, one of the things that we've done, and I've heard this earlier in your group, so we actually started a COVID cohort. So we have now over 500 people that we're following longitudinally that have done studies with us, and we want to see how they're doing over the period of the COVID pandemic. But if you think about it, if you have state observation mappings, like say, for example, you see your colleague in the morning when you come to work and they say, "Hey, Sophia, how you doing? Good to see you." That gives you an internal state, and that mapping is daily reinforced and is very, very, so the uncertainty around that mapping is actually very small, right? Because you've encountered that repeatedly. And that's really what the free parameters tell you, is how precise is that mapping is one of the parameters. But now you are maybe at home, maybe in San Francisco, maybe in Minnesota, and you don't have those same feedbacks that give you observation, that gives you a sense of your internal state. So it's very understandable that people are trying to figure out in this changed world who they really are, in a true sense of the word. Because again, with a hidden state model, is you have a belief about how you are, but that belief comes from the observations that you normally get in a certain way on a day-by-day basis, and that has changed. And it's the same. What's interesting, it would be interesting to see, is whether people with severe mental illness, how their observation change as a function of this COVID pandemic. It might be very different, quite frankly, because maybe their state observations for some people may not change that much, because for most part they might have been isolated before and they're isolated now. But for some it may actually change quite dramatically. And it also has implication for how they interact with providers, right? Because before they were coming to a clinic, they were presenting, they have personal interactions. Now that is all done virtually. So yes, I do think that that uncertainty around the state observation mapping is definitely altered in this relatively new state that we call the COVID pandemic.
Well, thank you. I don't want to dominate here.
Yeah. We have one question. Martin, you can.
Yeah, I can see it. So David, yeah.
I can unmute. So Martin, really nice talk, phenomenal stuff.
Thank you.
Sorry I missed the earlier meeting. I had to teach. I wanted to ask about, I really like this intriguing idea about the difference between decision uncertainty and reward uncertainty as driving this anxiety question. Mm-hmm. It looked like you were simply using the active inference Bayesian fit to get and split those. Yeah. Does your task have two separable parameters that can split them, or are you making the assumption that they're somehow magically balanced? Because my memory from those active inference models is that they have a lot of underlying assumptions to do that balance. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense. And in fact, so this is where the structure of the task is actually helpful. Because we have the decision uncertainty, which is I do something and then I have a certain outcome, and what's my expectation of how precise I know what the outcome will be, and that has to do with we have so that little guy moves from one side to the other side, and each is associated with a certain probability. So that in a sense calibrates the decision uncertainty for the subject. But then we have different trial types where we have different reward levels. So we have the reward level of 2 points, 4 points, and 6 points. So by having basically the decision uncertainty related to the position of the person and the reward level 2, 4, and 6, we were able to separate the decision uncertainty from the reward uncertainty by the paradigm. But if that makes sense.
It does make sense. It makes I can see the logic of it. It makes the assumption that they are linearly separable, that they don't, that they're not interacting.
Yeah, and again, one of the things that, and you, obviously you know that, is that the problem that we're facing, that when we come to interacting parameters, the number of trials we need to get to even be able to uniquely identify interactions is very large. And so it's entirely possible that there are interactions. I just don't think we have the statistical power to test that. You know, that's one of the, it's certainly one of the limitations.
Cool, thanks. Fantastic stuff.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Other questions? Were
I was either fully clear or totally obtuse, but I hope that people got something out of it. I know that these, you know, it's a new medium, and if, you know, again, if people have particular questions about tasks or want me to follow up with them, I'd be happy to. I'm a compulsive email answerer, so just send me an email, and I'll hopefully I can get back to you and. You know, kind of follow up with some of the.
Well, I just want to say, Martin, I think it's so important, the work that you've been doing to translate and communicate some of these principles, because, you know, I think the field right now for psychiatry, right, it's very bimodal. There's a very small handful of people who are, you know, are being trained in these approaches or principles, or have training, or collaborating with people, and are beginning to understand this language and this conceptual approach. And then I think the vast majority of people in psychiatry, including people in academic psychiatry, this is a whole new language and a whole new set of concepts. And so just, you know, for many, it's just being introduced to, I think, as Josh Gordon would say, you know, bringing mathematics into how we understand our patients.
Yeah, yeah. So I completely agree with you. And let me. There's one more question, which is actually a good one. And then, but let me before answering that question, I think that. So let me tell you a little bit about my own history, which is why I'm motivated to hopefully, you know, like the famous title this time is different. So when I first started sort of my academic career. At that time, I was working with Arnold Mandel at UCSD, who was a big proponent of dynamical systems applications in psychiatry. And we do all kinds of stuff in terms of, you know, using Lyapunov exponent and topological entropy and things like that. Really kind of you know, what I would consider pretty cool stuff. And we were able to, you know, find some interesting findings. And we did some early behavioral stuff with people with schizophrenia, actually with David Braff. But the whole field fizzled because I think we failed to really translate to the community at large what the advantages of these approaches might be. And so in a way, I've sort of been through it once. And what I'm hoping to do, and quite frankly, you know, it's not for myself, because I realize that you have to be a young person who is fully engaged in this and can push the field forward. But I'm hoping that I can play a role in opening up the field this time for the community at large, and make it hopefully a little bit more palatable to those people who don't want to learn the equations, right? Who don't want to learn, and who don't, you know, we all have our preferences and specifics and whatever not. So that's really why I think, from my perspective, I'm really fully committed to try to make things as transparent as possible. Sometimes I achieve it and sometimes I don't, but that's sort of the personal history. But the question that was raised, which is really an important one, is how is the free energy principle different from prediction errors? It's a very good, so first of all, so prediction errors, I presume in this context is prediction error with respect to a value, right? Because that's basically what forms a prediction error in the typical reward learning or in a reward framework. So the idea is that that you're correcting your behavior based on how far you are away from the value you want to accomplish or you want to attain. And the presumption is, and that's sort of reward maximization, that you want to get better values. Right? So that's one thing. And that would be prediction error driven. Now there's prediction error. There's a prediction error in the free energy principle too. But the prediction error is driven by two terms. There's the preference term, which is, it's a reformulation. Carl wouldn't acknowledge to that, but it's essentially a reward framework, because you code preferences as what he calls concentration parameters. He just uses different language, but you basically create a preference matrix, and you say, okay, I want the probability of this state should be higher than the probability of this state. That is nothing else but saying I like this better than that. But it's, but the other part of it that is not in a typical reward framework is the second part of the free energy, which is essentially the information that is contained in the action that you're going to be taking. So what does that mean? It means that if I do the same thing over and over again, there's no new information there. And that is coded in this entropy term. If I do the same thing over and over again, I have no information that is added. But what Carl in his active inference, we don't just want to do the same thing over and over again. There is value now in the framework of active inference. There is value to knowledge about different things. So, for example, if let's take the classic T-maze. You have a T-maze where a rat sits on one end and then can go either to the left side or to the right side to get a piece of food or something. And so based on the reward learning literature, the animal just learns to go to the left side and kind of come back. So why would the animal go to the right side and explore the right side? Because all the previous says, okay, I should go to the left side. Well, there's information there. And the animal doesn't know what that information is. So you have to assign some degree of value to that information. And in the free energy principle formalizes that by having the term of the preference and the term of the information value, and brings those two together.
Martin, thank you so much for taking your time and doing this virtual visit with us. I know you'll be meeting with some other people this afternoon, but thank you again for joining us and presenting this talk.
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you everybody for staying on, and I really enjoyed it. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.